The wind howled across the prairie like it was searching for someone. The last light of day disappeared beneath the horizon, leaving nothing but frostbite in the air and silence between the trees. Near the edge of the valley, a log cabin stood alone, its chimney trailing smoke, its windows glowing soft orange against the snow-covered hills. Inside, Gideon Rourke stirred stew over the fire, the familiar ache in his shoulder reminding him of old wounds that hadn't healed with time. He wasn't expecting company, he hadn't in years. And then came the knock, or more accurately, the thud. He opened the door to find a woman collapsed at his doorstep, cradling something in her arms. A baby. She was half buried in snow, her bonnet soaked through, her lips blue. The child whimpered weakly, wrapped in what looked like a patched blanket in pure desperation. Gideon acted on instinct. He scooped them both up and brought them inside, laying the woman near the hearth while gently lifting the infant from her grasp. "Easy now," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "You're safe. You're here." The baby was cold but breathing. The woman, thin, pale, and unconscious, murmured in her sleep. A single word. "Please." Gideon worked through the night, warming broth, laying blankets, whispering to a child that wasn't his, in a house that had been far too quiet for far too long. And as the snow kept falling, and the fire crackled louder than the wind outside, something inside Gideon stirred. Something he thought had died with his wife 3 winters ago. At dawn, she opened her eyes, brown, wide, wary. "You're safe," he said quietly, kneeling beside her. "You're in my home." She tried to sit, but her body betrayed her. "My son. He's fine, sleeping now, you both made it." She blinked hard, as if unsure whether to cry or bolt. Where am I?" "My ranch, outside of Elkhorn Ridge." She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to find help." "You found it," he said simply. "Name's Gideon Rourke." She hesitated, then whispered, Clara Wells." He didn't ask more than that. But deep down, he already knew. No one walks through a blizzard carrying a child unless the place they left was worse than the storm. Clara slept through most of the day. Her body was still weak, but the color had returned to her cheeks, and Gideon was relieved to see her breathing steady, if shallow. The baby, barely 6 months by his guess, stayed quiet except for soft whimpers, like even he understood not to make too much noise in this unfamiliar place. Gideon had cleaned and fed him as best he could, using what few supplies he kept for emergencies. His cabin wasn't built for babies. It had been a long time since any sound other than the crackle of fire or his own footsteps filled these rooms, but the silence didn't feel as heavy now. When Clara finally opened her eyes again, it was dusk. She tried to sit up, and this time Gideon helped her gently. "Easy," he murmured. "You're not strong enough yet." Clara's hand went instantly to the edge of the blanket. "My baby?" "He's safe, right here." She turned her head to the cradle Gideon had fashioned out of a drawer in thick wool. Her eyes filled at the sight of her son sleeping, warm and peaceful. "His name's Jonah," she whispered. Gideon nodded. "Strong name." They sat in silence for a while. Gideon stirred the fire. Clara stared into it like it might erase the memories clinging to her skin. Then she said quietly, "My husband left 2 weeks ago. Said he was going to fetch work in Dodge. Never came back. Left me with a baby and half a sack of flour." Gideon didn't respond. He just let her talk. "I waited as long as I could. Then Jonah got sick. I had to leave. There was nowhere else to go." Her voice trembled at the end, and she turned her face away. "You did the right thing," Gideon said. "No one ever says that to me," she whispered. "You're hearing it now." He didn't ask what else had happened, about the bruises fading along her wrist, or the haunted look in her eyes. He figured if she wanted to tell him, she would. In time. Instead, he stood and handed her a cup of warm broth. She took it with both hands, fingers shaking. "Why'd you help us?" she asked. Gideon stared into the fire. "Because someone once helped me, when I didn't deserve it." Outside, the wind had finally died down, but inside the cabin, something had started to move, slowly, quietly, like the coals of a long-dead fire finding breath again. The days that followed moved gently, like snow melting from the trees. Clara regained her strength slowly, first standing with Gideon's help, then walking short distances around the cabin. She insisted on helping where she could, washing dishes, sweeping the hearth, holding Jonah close while Gideon chopped wood outside. He tried to tell her she didn't owe him anything, but she always replied the same. "I need to feel useful again." He understood that more than most. Gideon had been a man of routine. Wake before dawn, tend the animals, chop wood, cook the same stew, sit in silence, sleep in a half-cold bed, repeat. But now, the rhythm had shifted. He'd catch himself listening for Jonah's soft babble in the mornings. He found new ways to cook stew with Clara's suggestions. The cabin was cleaner, warmer, more alive, and every now and then, when she smiled, truly smiled, it was like watching sunlight break through winter. One afternoon, as Gideon sharpened his tools on the porch, Clara stepped outside with Jonah on her hip. "Thought you might want some company," she said, handing him a tin cup of coffee. He looked up, startled. "You didn't need to—" "I know," she interrupted. "But I wanted to." She sat beside him. Jonah cooed as Gideon made faces at him. "He likes you," Clara said softly. "He has good taste," Gideon deadpanned. Clara laughed. Not a shy giggle, but a real laugh that pulled at something deep inside Gideon's chest. A moment passed. Then she asked, "Was your wife kind?" Gideon nodded slowly. "She was quiet, loved to read. Used to hum while she cooked." Clara looked down. "I don't hum much. I used to sing, but I stopped." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because the only person who used to listen stopped listening." Gideon set the sharpening stone aside. "Well, I'd listen." Clara met his eyes, unsure, caught off guard. He didn't smile, he just meant it. That night, after Jonah fell asleep in his makeshift cradle, Clara sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. Gideon brought over a piece of cornbread, fresh and golden. She took it with a small thanks, then said quietly, "You don't know what this means to me." "You don't have to explain." "I want to." She looked at him full of shadows and hope. "But maybe not tonight." He nodded. "Whenever you're ready." The fire crackled. The snow fell. And in that quiet cabin, something fragile and steady began to take root. Not out of rescue, but out of recognition. The first time Clara stepped beyond the cabin's edge, she hesitated. Jonah was wrapped tight in a quilt, sleeping against her chest. The snow had melted enough to reveal patches of brown earth, and the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Gideon walked a few steps ahead, stopping now and then to glance back. "You all right?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Just haven't breathed real air in a long time." "You've been breathing." "Not like this," she said, her voice small. They walked toward the small barn at the edge of the property. Chickens clucked lazily inside their coop, and a single gray horse lifted its head at their approach. "That's Remy," Gideon said, patting the horse's neck. "He's old, grumpy, and smarter than most people I know." Clara smiled. "He looks gentle." "He is, but he's also the only one who still gives me the stink eye when I'm late with breakfast." Inside the barn, Gideon showed her where he kept extra feed, the old tools, and the tiny loft where he sometimes napped in the warmer months. "I built most of this myself," he admitted. After my wife passed, I needed something to keep my hands busy." Clara ran her fingers along the wood grain. "It's beautiful." He looked at her then, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude. Grief. A recognition that both had lost something they never expected to regain. Later that evening, Clara sat on the porch while Jonah slept soundly in his makeshift cradle. Gideon joined her with 2 mugs of tea. "I've been meaning to ask," she said. "Why do you live all the way out here alone?" He took a sip before answering. "I didn't always. Used to live in town. My wife liked being close to people, even if I didn't. But after she got sick, she wanted quiet. We moved here. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to go back." Clara nodded. "I know what it's like, to leave behind a place because it holds too many echoes." He looked at her gently. "You planning to keep moving?" She didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, "I don't know. I just wanted Jonah to have a chance, even if it meant walking through snow with nowhere to go." Gideon's jaw tightened. No mother should have to make that choice. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clara turned to him, her voice tentative. "I want to help around here. Not just sweeping or mending. Real work. Something that matters." He gave a short nod. "Then we'll find something that does." And with that, the porch didn't feel quite as cold. The house didn't feel quite as empty. And Clara, for the first time in a long while, didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like she might belong. Spring came slow, as it always did on the frontier. But with each thawing morning, life inside the cabin changed. Jonah grew stronger, his laughter now echoing through the halls like sunlight and sound. Clara, though still guarded, began to move with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. She woke early, helped feed the chickens, learned how to split kindling without nicking her fingers. And every now and then, Gideon caught her humming under her breath while tending the stew pot, a tune so faint it barely touched the air. But he noticed. He always noticed. One morning, Gideon brought in a small bundle of wildflowers, their colors muted but bright against the wooden table. "They grow behind the ridge," he said, a little awkward. "Thought the table could use something cheerful." Clara blinked. "No one's brought me flowers in years." He shrugged. Figured it was time someone did. That night, after Jonah had fallen asleep with a wooden spoon in his hand and crumbs on his cheek, Clara lingered by the fire longer than usual. I used to dream about a place like this, she said softly. Gideon glanced up from the book in his lap. The cabin? No. The quiet, the safety, the warmth. She paused. Most places I've stayed, I never took off my shoes. Didn't know how long I'd be allowed to stay. Gideon closed his book. You can take them off here, Clara. She looked at him, eyes glistening. I mean it, he added. You and Jonah aren't just passing through. Not unless you want to be. She stared into the fire, voice thick. I want to believe that. He leaned forward slightly. Then let me help you. There was no embrace. No grand declaration. Just two people sitting in the soft glow of firelight, slowly stitching their lives together with words and silence. The next day, Clara found a patch of earth behind the barn and began to dig. She wanted a garden. Tomatoes, maybe? She said, brushing hair from her eyes. Carrots, beans. Gideon stood beside her, shovel in hand. That'll take time. She smiled. I've got time now. And so they worked, side by side. She sowing seeds in the soil. He sowing something quieter in her heart. And both of them learning that home isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you're finally allowed to stay. Weeks passed. The garden took shape. What started as a modest patch of turned earth behind the barn slowly became a sign of life, of intention. Clara planted each row with quiet purpose, tomatoes, beans, squash, and Gideon helped her build a small fence to keep the deer out. Jonah took his first steps between the cabbages. Clara cried when she saw him wobble, arms outstretched, falling into the soft dirt with a laugh. She hadn't thought joy would look like this. Small feet, dirty cheeks, and a smile that belonged only to the present. No fear, no running. Just now, one evening, Gideon found Clara outside long after the sun had set, kneeling in the dirt under the stars. You all right? He asked, holding out a lantern. She looked up, brushing a hand across her cheek. I think I'm finally starting to feel real again. He tilted his head. You weren't before? She smiled sadly. I was surviving. That's not the same. They sat together on the back steps, Jonah asleep inside. Do you ever wonder why? She asked. Why what? Why someone like you, alone grieving, would take in a stranger and her child? Gideon stared at the moon for a moment. Because I needed to be needed. Clara's breath caught. He continued, quieter now. After my wife passed, I didn't think I'd matter to anyone again. Then you showed up, half frozen and determined. And somehow, I wasn't invisible anymore. A silence passed, deep and thoughtful. Clara reached out and took his hand. Rough, warm, steady. I see you, she said. Every day, more than you know. That night, neither of them slept easily. Something had shifted. Not spoken aloud, but felt. Like rain in the distance. Like the scent of something blooming underground. The next morning, Clara braided her hair for the first time since arriving. She served breakfast with a quiet grace. And Gideon, noticing the way she smiled when their hands brushed over a plate, understood that the loneliness inside him had begun to rot, replaced by something hopeful, something real. Out in the field, under the open sky, life continued. But in the cabin, something more than life was growing. Something like love. The days grew longer, warmer. The scent of pine mingled with new blossoms, and Clara's garden began to sprout tiny green promises from the soil. Jonah chased chickens with wild giggles, and Gideon smiled more. Softly, subtly, but often. It was a peaceful rhythm, until a knock broke it. It came just after supper, a hard, deliberate pounding at the cabin door. Not like Clara's thud in the snow months ago, but something sharper, intentional. Gideon opened it to find two men, one older with a dusted gray beard, the other younger, lean and twitching with restlessness. Behind them stood a mule-drawn wagon, a half-spoiled sack of flour in the back. Name's Jesse Wilkes, the older man said, tipping his hat. Heard a woman came through these parts in the winter, traveling with a child. Clara stepped into the doorway behind Gideon and froze. Her voice was barely a whisper. That's him. Gideon didn't need to ask. He stepped in front of Clara, blocking her from view. She's safe here, he said evenly, and she ain't leaving unless she chooses to. Jesse's face remained composed, but his eyes sharpened. I didn't come to cause trouble. She's my sister-in-law. My brother's been asking for her. Your brother, Clara repeated. The one who disappeared and left us with nothing? Jesse's jaw flexed. He's sorry, wants to make things right. Gideon turned his head slightly. That true, Clara? You want to go back? She didn't answer right away, but her hand found Jonah's small shoulder behind the door. She stepped forward, her back straight despite the tremble in her voice. No, I don't want that life again. Jesse's eyes narrowed, but he tipped his hat again. Then I reckon you made your choice. Without another word, he and the younger man turned back to the wagon. Clara didn't speak until the sound of wheels and hoofbeats vanished into the trees. Then she collapsed into Gideon's arms, shaking. That night they sat on the porch wrapped in a shared blanket. Clara stared at the moon. I thought I'd feel scared forever. You're safe here, Gideon said softly. I won't let anyone change that. She looked at him, really looked. I know. And when she leaned her head against his shoulder, he didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stayed there, quiet, constant, and warm, like a promise kept without words. The tension from Jesse Wilkes's visit hung in the air for days, thin and stretched like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Clara stayed close to Jonah, watching the road more than she used to. Gideon quietly repaired the fencing near the barn, hammering harder than necessary. But time, like wildflowers, has a way of reclaiming things. A week later, Clara brought in the season's first harvest from the garden. Handfuls of lettuce, tiny carrots, a single plump tomato. She laid them gently on the table, dirt still clinging to their roots. They're small, she said, brushing hair from her cheek. But they're ours. Gideon ran his hand along the edge of the table, then looked at her. No one ever grew something here before you? Clara smiled faintly. I'm tired of running, Gideon. He nodded. Then don't. That night, Clara cooked a stew from the garden, added herbs she'd dried herself, and baked bread that filled the cabin with warmth long before it touched their mouths. Jonah ate 2 helpings, cheeks flushed and happy. Afterward, when the boy had fallen asleep near the hearth, Gideon washed the dishes while Clara dried. Their hands moved in quiet rhythm until hers lingered on his. May I ask you something? She said, not looking up. Of course. Do you ever think there might be more than safety here? Gideon's hand paused. You mean more than shelter, more than a roof? She finally met his gaze. I mean you and me. The silence between them deepened. But it wasn't empty. It was full of moments they hadn't named yet. Glances, shared laughter, that first hesitant touch. It was full of possibility. I do think about it, he said, his voice low. But I didn't want to ask too soon. You didn't, she said. He reached for her hand then, not as a protector, not as a caretaker, but as a man asking permission to believe in something again. And when Clara laced her fingers with his, the question between them didn't need an answer. It was already clear. Outside, the wind rustled the trees gently. Inside, hearts settled like roots finally allowed to take hold. The days that followed felt different, gentler somehow. It wasn't just the way Clara smiled a little longer in the mornings, or the way Gideon's hand would find hers as they walked the rows of sprouting vegetables. It was the way their silences no longer felt like voids. They were full, comfortable, shared. One morning, Clara found an old tin box beneath a floorboard in the cabin. Inside were faded photographs, a lock of auburn hair tied with ribbon, and a small journal. She sat on the floor and opened it. Gideon stepped into the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. When he saw what she was reading, he paused. My wife kept that, he said quietly. Her name was May. Clara looked up. She wrote about you. I haven't read it since she passed. She hesitated, then closed the journal gently and set it beside her. She loved you deeply, Gideon. His throat worked. She was my beginning. I thought she'd be my only chapter. Clara rose, walked to him. She was part of your story. That doesn't mean the book has to end. That night, Clara pulled Jonah into her lap and told him a story. Not one from a book, but one about seeds and healing, about kindness at a doorstep, and about how not every stranger is someone to fear. Some are meant to be family. Gideon listened from the porch, her voice weaving into the stars above. Later, as the fire dimmed and the wind turned cooler, Clara stepped outside to join him. She carried a blanket, which she draped over both their shoulders. I used to believe I was only ever meant to survive, she said. You've done more than survive, he answered. You've helped me live again. She tilted her head toward his. Do you think there's more waiting for us? He looked at her for a long time. I think there already is. In the hush between heartbeats, he leaned in, and this time there were no ghosts in the room. No shadows, just a kiss. Soft, true, and born from everything unsaid. Jonah stirred inside the cabin. Clara pulled away, smiling. He'll be calling for me. Gideon brushed his thumb along her cheek. Then we'll both go to him. They stepped back inside the warmth together, and though the fire had dimmed, the home they'd built burned bright with the quiet, enduring glow of love finally welcomed in. The summer sun rose earlier now, spreading golden light across the fields, over the cabin, and into the windows where laughter had become a daily visitor. Jonah no longer cried out at night. Clara no longer checked the door twice. And Gideon? He no longer sat alone at meals. Something had settled between them, something real. One morning, Clara stood by the garden fence, staring at the rows of vegetables that had finally grown thick and full. Jonah ran in circles nearby, chasing his own shadow. Gideon walked up behind her, quiet as usual. She didn't turn. Do you ever wonder why your path didn't end where you thought it would? Gideon leaned on the fence beside her. Sometimes. But then I look at you two, and I stop wondering. That afternoon, they took a trip into the small town down the valley. It was Clara's first time since the winter. Heads turned. Some faces looked curious, others disapproving. But Clara walked with her head held high, Jonah on her hip and Gideon at her side. At the general store, the shopkeeper glanced at the trio and gave a slight nod. Good to see you back, Mr. Ellis. Gideon nodded politely. This is Clara, and this little rascal is Jonah. Clara waited for hesitation, judgment. But instead, the shopkeeper leaned down and offered Jonah a peppermint. Welcome, he said. We don't see many smiles like that round here. You're lucky. Clara blinked, surprised. So are we. They bought flour, sugar, and fabric. Clara picked a sky blue ribbon for her hair and blushed when Gideon noticed. On the way home, the wagon creaked over the hills, and Jonah napped in the back beside a sack of potatoes. Clara rested her head on Gideon's shoulder. I never dreamed of this, she whispered. Of what? Being seen, being safe, being chosen. Gideon turned his head slightly, his voice steady. Then let me say it plain. I choose you, Clara. You and Jonah. She didn't cry. She just held his hand and closed her eyes as the wind lifted the scent of wildflowers around them. That evening, they cooked together in the cabin. Jonah helped mash the potatoes and dropped more on the floor than the pot. They laughed. They danced, clumsily in the kitchen, with music that came only from memory and hearts too full to hold it all. When the day ended, they watched the stars from the porch once again. But this time, Clara leaned her head against Gideon's chest, not just as someone healing, but as someone home. The story that began with frost and fear now warmed like a fire that never died. And though the world outside would change again, and storms might come someday, inside this home there would always be shelter. There would always be love.